Before I start, I would like to provide some context. I don't particularly like using the terminology atheist, theist, agnostic, deist, anti-theist, apatheist, etc., because they're usually either used or misused as blanket umbrella statements to oversimplify what people actually believe. So let me be absolutely clear from what direction I am analyzing this film. The Oxford English Dictionary's definition of the word atheist is a person who disbelieves or lacks belief in the existence of God or gods. This is probably the best word to describe my own view, although it's a little simplistic. I, like most atheists, do not believe in any god because there is no compelling evidence that there is a god. I consider this to be both rational and logical. If I were presented with the evidence, and I would like to think any rational and logical atheist, would immediately be swayed provided the evidence was undeniable. My mum is a Protestant Christian, and we frequently debate the existence of God, and so when I went to visit her last Christmas, she wanted me to watch a certain movie with her. I could just agree with her on the topic of religion, but then we would both be wrong. The movie in question is titled The Case for Christ. It's a 2017 film based on the book written by Lee Strobel. Strobel did not write the screenplay for the film, but he was credited as the executive producer. He has also stated that the film is between 80 and 85% accurate and claims that certain scenes are like a transcript. The film follows Strobel, a journalist and atheist who sets out to disprove the existence of God. Through his investigation, he transitions from an unwavering atheist to a Christian. I have not read the book, nor do I plan to, so I won't be commenting on how accurately the film translates what really happened. I will be analyzing the arguments the film presents, as well as how it portrays both Christians and atheists. Before digging in, I think it's important to clarify on what specifically The Case for Christ is trying to prove. It is trying, firstly, to prove that the universe has a creator. This is a concept which, although I am an atheist, I would not consider to be particularly unlikely. It is, however, virtually impossible to prove either way. It is simply a question we will never have the answer to. The Case for Christ is also trying to prove that this infinitely powerful creator of the universe is not only aware of my existence, but that he also cares about me personally. It is trying to prove that this God made the decision to intervene specifically on planet Earth after 200,000 years of watching the human species live and die. If the Gospel of Luke is to be believed, this God then forcibly impregnated a 15-year-old virgin using sorcery without any kind of consent or permission, for an angel simply appeared to her and told her, "Mary, you have found favor with God. You will conceive in your womb and bear a son, and you will name him Jesus. The Holy Spirit will come on you." The Holy Spirit will come upon you. The child to be born will be holy. Luke chapter 1 verses 30 to 35. As an interesting side note, when viewed through the lens of modern law, artificially inseminating a 15-year-old girl without her permission, whether through supernatural means or through a syringe, is, well, it's child rape, isn't it? Bear with me here. This God then had this child tortured and killed to symbolically absolve all of humanity from all past, present, and future sins. In other words, the Case for Christ is trying to prove that the specifically Christian interpretation of a God is the right one. I don't think it's controversial to say that it's categorically impossible to prove the existence of any God due to the nature of God. If the Christian God was scientifically provable, there would not be 1.8 billion people who believe in Allah, 1.2 billion people who do not believe in any god, 1.1 billion people who believe in Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. If the Christian God were objectively verifiable by science, every single person on Earth who acknowledges scientific reasoning would believe in the Christian God, and would thus be a Christian. Evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins famously said, "We cannot disprove God, just as we can't disprove Thor, fairies, leprechauns, and the flying spaghetti monster." In spite of this, The Case for Christ sets out to do the impossible, and as with most impossible quests, it fails absolutely. One final disclaimer before I dig in. This video is intended to be a fair analysis from someone with a basic understanding of science. The purpose of this video is not to offend Christians or any other people of faith, but, and I will put this as concisely as possible, I don't care if you are offended. So whilst I won't be saying anything directly intended to insult, I also won't be tiptoeing around the issue with any pretense of being respectful. As the saying goes, Jesus loves you, but I don't have to. If you don't think think you can handle that, I'd suggest not watching the rest of this video. I found The Case for Christ to be extremely biased, manipulative, one-dimensional, and comparable to watching Nazi war propaganda. The film is a perfect demonstration of confirmation bias. Lee Strobel's perspective when writing his book, and the filmmaker's perspective when making this film, is that God exists. They are going to prove it. The result is an extremely biased piece of propaganda. The initial spark for the narrative and the catalyst which eventually led to the real Lee Strobel seeing the light and converting to Christianity is his decision to attempt to disprove the resurrection of Jesus. Or to put it another way, he tries to apply a scientific methodology to something supernatural and fundamentally both indisputable and unverifiable. The film exists to reaffirm the belief of people who already believe in God. This film fails absolutely at providing a single piece of compelling evidence to non-believers. This is why I felt compelled to rebuke the film. Rather than tackle each point chronologically, I found it made more sense to categorize each problem with the film, as it repeatedly makes the same mistakes. In this first video, I will go into the depictions of atheists and the depictions of Christians, and in part 2, I will cover the actual evidence that the film presents. To help me explain why the filmmakers behind The Case for Christ and many other religious people misinterpret, either deliberately or through sheer ignorance, what an atheist actually is, I would like to propose a hypothetical debate. Let's say we have an agnostic person who is unsure whether or not there is a God, and a religious person who wants to convince them that their God is the right one. In order to attempt to convince the agnostic that their God is real, the religious person would need to provide evidence. The religious person is making a claim, and therefore the burden of proof lies with them. If the agnostic hears this evidence and then decides this sounds like absolute horse shit, then that would make them an atheist. Now let's replay this conversation, but replace the religious person with an atheist. As an atheist is someone who lacks belief in any god, there is no burden of proof. An atheist cannot be compelled to prove that there are no gods, firstly because that is fundamentally impossible, but more importantly because they are not claiming that there are no gods. They are just conscious of the fact that there isn't any evidence that there are. So if the atheist were to attempt to convince the agnostic that there is no God, the atheist would likely provide the same evidence that the religious person provided, but they would then conclude by saying, by the way, this is absolute horseshit. The common perception seems to be that atheism and being religious are two opposing sides of the same coin, when the more apt analogy would be that being religious is claiming that there is a coin, and atheism is denying that there is a coin based on the lack of evidence. So now I'll move on to specific examples presented in The Case for Christ. Until his conversion, every time Lee argues with his wife Leslie, he is presented as an arrogant dick, and she is presented as mild-tempered and tolerant. The first time that this bias is displayed is the scene that kicks off the film. Strobel, conveniently, is the one who gives his daughter the money to buy the candy that she then nearly chokes on. If I was going to give the film the benefit of the doubt, I'd argue that Strobel is the one with the job and is probably the one paying for the meal. It seems more likely, though, that the filmmakers wanted to contrast the atheist Strobel with the omnibenevolent Christian who saves the daughter's life shortly afterwards. That evening, after the incident at the restaurant, Strobel's daughter asks,
Mom, who's Jesus?
Leslie begins to answer her question, telling her that Jesus was a great man, before Lee rudely cuts her off and explains that believing in God is kinda like fairy tales and really nice stories. Lee is a dick. Lee is rude to his wife. Lee is an atheist. Lee is rude. See what they did there? Subtle. Also, Leslie is polite. Leslie is a Christian. Leslie doesn't get angry that Lee was rude. Also subtle. The continuation of this scene was when the film made it clear how delusional and one-sided it was going to be.
We are atheists. Atheists don't believe in God.
Well, what do they believe?
They believe in what's real, in what we can see, what we can touch.
Before I dig into this, here is a quote from neuroscientist and author Sam Harris. Atheism is not a philosophy. It is not even a view of the world. It is simply a refusal to deny the obvious. To elaborate on this, atheism is a lack of belief. Atheism is not a belief in nothing or a belief in something other than one or many gods. Atheism is the absence of any belief in any gods. I do not consider that any atheist could ever do something such as indoctrinate a child and tell them, this is what our family believes and therefore you believe it too. The more discerning viewers of this film will notice that the way atheism is depicted in this scene is precisely the way many families speak about their chosen religion in real life. The following scene shows us how Leslie is not particularly happy about Lee imposing his beliefs on their daughter, and the irony is palpable.
I thought we said we weren't going to force anything on her.
She asked.
Right, so as long as it's what we believe.
Are we really gonna go around on this again, Les?
I guess so.
Next, we see Lee at his job as an investigative journalist. Remember, because Lee is an atheist, he is also a dick.
My new book. Just picked these up from the mailroom. Wanted you to be the first to see it. Want an autographed copy of my new book?
Not one bit.
Ooh. Jealousy doesn't look good on you, my friend. And again, nothing does.
I'll take a book if they're still offering.
Hey, London. Hear that? Got my first taker.
The film does this quite a lot, so I'll just condense it into different rounds of Lee being a dick. Now we have round 3 of Lee being a dick.
Invited me to her church, and I went.
Really? Oh, I would have loved to have seen that. What are you telling me, Les? You what? Why? Why would you? You kidding me, Les?
I know this is a lot.
A lot?
hon.
A lot? You dropped this on me. What does that even mean? No,
Yes,
okay, okay,
yes.
this is not us, Leslie. Whatever this is, okay, it is not us.
Round 4 of Lee being a dick.
Sweetheart, I'm not the one who went and changed. You did that.
What?
Yes, you're cheating on me with Jesus.
You're hilarious.
You went off the deep end, and now you're pissed off because I won't jump in after you.
Later in the film, Strobel attends a debate. At this debate, we see an exaggerated caricature, presumably based on people like Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens. I am not surprised at all that this movie is depicting the atheist speaker as being an arrogant butthole, but I can't help but highlight that the film didn't allow this character to actually give any kind of argument. Again, if I were to give the film the benefit of the doubt, I'd say maybe it would have taken too much time for the film to show more of this debate, but it definitely seems more likely that the filmmakers wanted to distill the new atheist movement into one single, simplistic, and condescending line of dialogue. Leslie then invites Lee to church, where the pastor just so happens to be talking about things that are 100% relevant to Lee's current state of mind. At this point in the film, however, Lee hasn't yet decided to pledge allegiance to the all-knowing one, so you know what that means? It's time for round 5 of Lee being a dick.
This whole thing with Leslie, it needs to stop. Putting ideas in her head, you're drawing her into this, and I know how this works. I know you folks have a mandate, okay? You need to raise money, you need to get the good news out, and all that. I'm just letting you know that you're gonna need to find someone else to recruit. She is vulnerable, and you are taking advantage. She's my wife, this is our life, and I want you to stay out of it. Now, is that clear?
Then the film does give us a slight change of pace. We then meet Lee's dad, and it is clear that they have an extremely strained relationship. Actually, I'm joking. This is the setting for round 6 of Lee being a dick.
It's a beautiful name, but John has been in the Strobel line for generations.
There we go, because I didn't want to name my son John, okay?
Your grandpa's John, so's your older brother.
Mm-hmm. It's also the euphemism for a toilet.
We learn that Lee has given up on a relationship with his dad because his dad never cared about him, and now he only wants to be part of his life now that he has grandchildren. Lee later sees a psychiatrist who states that the greatest names in atheism, Hume, Nietzsche, Sartre, and Freud, all had a father who either died when they were young, abandoned them, or was physically or emotionally abusive. Although this is mildly interesting, it comes out of nowhere, and it doesn't amount to anything, so I think the filmmakers shoehorned this in to reinforce the perspective that atheists are broken, lost, and misguided creatures. After witnessing Leslie's weird and antiquated ritualistic dunking ceremony in a lake, he goes and gets drunk and starts smashing things and yelling at his daughter. Turns out Lee is still a dick, because he is still an atheist. Eventually, though, Lee starts to experience serious doubt about whether or not God is real. He states, "Even in our disbelief, we still take a leap of faith." The real Lee Strobel has said almost exactly the same thing. He said that it would have required more faith for him to remain an atheist than it would for him to accept that the Christian God is real and convert to Christianity. This needs dissecting. The definition of faith is firm belief in something for which there is no proof. As a side point, if we extrapolate no proof to mean the same thing as not true, then by definition, faith means essentially the same thing as delusion, which is defined as the act of believing or making yourself believe something that is not true. The case for Christ is effectively stating that there is no proof for what atheists believe. The film is trying to say that it is hypocritical for an atheist to criticize a religious person for believing something based on faith, because the absence of a belief in any gods also requires faith. This only makes any sense if we start the argument from the position that God exists, as there is still no evidence that God exists. Saying that people who refuse to take a leap of faith and believe in God are themselves also taking a leap of faith is well, retarded. Atheists don't believe that there is no God. They're just conscious that there is no evidence that there is. End of discussion. Belief doesn't factor into the equation. And when he has finally decided that God is in fact real, Lee suddenly stops being a dick. In pretty much every scene that atheist Lee appears, he is a dick. As soon as he concludes that the Christian God must be real, he turns into a soft-spoken, loving, and sensitive husband, which leads us neatly into the next section of this video. So as you may have guessed by now, the film is equally biased in its representation of Christians. Whereas Lee is a dick until he sees the truth, all of the Christian characters are absolutely tolerant and enlightened. I'll highlight examples of this. After her daughter is saved by Alfie the Christian nurse, Leslie decides to visit her.
What if you hadn't been there?
There is no what if with God.
What Alfie is saying here is that everything happens as God had planned it. There is no point in asking what if, because God doesn't allow for what ifs. Later, we also get this.
And I don't believe that it was a coincidence that you came to the restaurant. I don't.
Let me pull up a totally unrelated clip from a debate between Sam Harris and Christian apologist William Lane Craig.
9 million children die every year before they reach the age of 5. Okay, picture an Asian tsunami of the sort we saw in 2004 that killed 250,000 people. One of those every 10 days, killing children only under 5. Okay, it's 24,000 children a day, 1,000 an hour, 17 or so a minute. That means before I can get to the end of this sentence, some few children, very likely, will have died in terror and agony. Okay, think of the parents of these children. Think of the fact that most of these men and women believe in God and are praying at this moment for their children to be spared. And their prayers will not be answered.
I don't think I need to explain why Alfie's way of thinking is absurd, but if you still don't get it, you might want to look elsewhere, as I have neither the desire nor the crayons to explain it to you. Following this scene, we get a hilariously manipulative scene of the two of them in a church, accompanied by delicate flutes and acoustic guitars. And all this scene really does is further reaffirm that God just exists, whether we like it or not. No evidence is actually given, of course, but I really wasn't expecting any, as this scene takes place in a church. Later, we revisit Leslie and Alfie, who are talking about Lee.
What is it that Lee believes in again?
Just the facts.
I get what the filmmakers were trying to do here, which was to show that both Leslie and Alfie are fundamentally superior to Lee because they are Christians, but they ignore one detail. Facts are true whether or not you believe in them. They do not require your approval. Saying Lee believes in facts is a fundamentally meaningless statement. Then we get blah blah blah, God is real and he's waiting for you, blah blah blah. During a later argument with Lee, Leslie says this.
I'm not acting crazy. Am I acting crazy?
Well, let's dissect that for a minute, Leslie. Your daughter was saved from choking by a nurse who happened to be a Christian. You have decided that this means there is an all-powerful, unknowable, invisible overlord who cares about you and your daughter. Does that sound crazy to you? I'll let you answer that, actually, Leslie.
I talked to Jesus. I told him I want him in my life.
Somewhere, Leslie, there is a tree working very, very hard to replace the oxygen you are currently wasting. I want you to find that tree and apologize to it.
I felt something.
A delusion is something that people believe in despite a total lack of evidence. I felt something is not evidence, therefore Leslie is utterly delusional.
Listen to what I'm trying to say, because I'm trying to explain that I felt something that is maybe more real than anything I've ever felt in my life.
More real than anything you felt in your life.
Okay, I'm not trying to compare.
Now, I would have added this to round 3 of Lee being a dick, but honestly, he's entirely justified in being this angry. If my partner said to me, hey, so I kind of feel really, really strongly that I kind of feel something vague and non-specific, and it's more real to me than anything I've felt in my life until now, I would go and get drunk due to the realization that I'm stuck with a crazy person. In the next scene, Lee goes and gets drunk because he is stuck with a crazy person. Unfortunately, though, that doesn't last long, and he remembers that they love each other. Now we are 21 minutes into the film, and it finally makes a reasonable point about faith that I can understand.
Whatever this is for Leslie, maybe it's not such a terrible thing. I mean, if it brings her comfort, Are you sure it's not something you can live with?
Personally, I do not think that faith is explicitly a bad thing. However, faith having utility in providing comfort and meaning is not any kind of argument for it being the truth. So don't try to tell me that what you believe is actually real or true. To quote Richard Dawkins again, faith is belief in spite of, or perhaps even because of, the lack of evidence. 1 hour into the film, Strobel starts to doubt his conviction. He doesn't know what to make of the evidence that he has discovered, namely multiple occasionally corroborative accounts from people who had no explicable reason to lie. This is the first time he's had any kind of doubt. So because Lee's atheism is wavering, I wonder what happens. He's allowed to not be a dick for the first time in the movie, so he asks Leslie to go out to dinner with him that night. After their night out, Lee asks,
I get that you want this to be true. But what if it's not? Wouldn't you want to know that before you've dedicated your entire life to it?
Of course.
Leslie, you have done precisely zero research or critical thinking on the subject. You have not made an educated decision. Your daughter was saved from choking by a nurse who happened to be a Christian. That is not evidence.
But what if it is? What if it is true? Wouldn't you want to know that?
Leslie, I'd imagine your asshole is getting very jealous of your mouth due to the unfathomable amount of shit that it has been spewing.
There's a verse that says, faith is the evidence of things we can't actually see.
Leslie, you are not pretty enough to be this much of a walking advert for birth control. Anyway, this is where things start to get semantic depending on your definition of faith, but I'll provide an example that I think works whichever way you cut it. If a man never leaves his house, but he has faith that the exterior of his house is painted yellow, that is in no way evidence that his house is painted yellow whatsoever. It might make the man feel warm and bubbly inside to imagine how yellow his house is, but the thing about evidence is that it's both verifiable and objective. Faith is neither verifiable nor objective. Leslie then says that she loves Lee more now than she did before. He asks her based on what. She states that since she accepted Jesus, she loves Lee more. Leslie must have forgotten to pay her brain bill because through what some would call intelligence, she then concludes that this is proof of something. At this point in the film, despite his wavering conviction, Lee is still a rational human being, and he responds by saying,
I don't know what is.
No, that's
I
not
don't
proof
know.
of anything. Les, that's feelings.
I won't add this to round 7 of Lee being a dick because what he said is irrefutable. It is a fact. He then tells Leslie that if she doesn't get her shit together, he will leave her. I mean, so far Leslie has shown herself to be gullible, delusional, condescending, and she makes a strong case for her own family tree being a circle. The impression the film gives is that Leslie never used to be intellectually inferior to a paperclip, and Lee understandably doesn't want to be married to someone who is insane. Unsure of what to do, Leslie visits the nurse and occasional mouthpiece and interpreter for the Ancient One, Alfie, again. And Alfie tells her,
But I can promise you this. In his time, and in his way, God always keeps his promises. And what did he promise Ezekiel? I will give you a new heart. I will put a new spirit in you. I will remove from you your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh.
Okay, I understand why this might be beneficial for Leslie to hear right now because it is motivational and comforting, but aside from this not being of any actual substance, I have a few things to point out. Firstly, Alfie believes that herself and others are in a position whereby they can interpret the will of an infinitely powerful, all-knowing deity. So, Alfie has a god complex? Secondly, Leslie is not Ezekiel. What God may or may not have told Ezekiel doesn't have anything to do with Leslie, but I guess metaphor, symbolism, shut up and read the Bible. In short, Alfie tells Leslie that she just needs to keep blindly believing in things that can't ever be proven, because at some point his supreme benevolence will intervene and fix all her problems. That concludes part 1 of my analysis of the case for Christ. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, liking, sharing, and subscribing will help me make more content like this in the future. Part 2 will be uploaded very soon. Thank you.